And so, I think we're all familiar. He went to Taiwan in 1949. And from there were about, he says, 300 to 500 of the saints that had come from the mainland. Although they had thousands, about 600 churches all over mainland China. 300 to 500 had gathered, had made it to Taiwan. So right away they began to meet and to preach the gospel, because the situation was quite crucial at that time. You know, because everyone thought that, if the communists take over the mainland China, then to take over Taiwan is just a small matter. That's just right off of their shore. Everyone thought Taiwan would be gone. Still there today. But at that time, right before Eisenhower was elected, you see, everyone thought, up until, I should say, Eisenhower was elected, from 49 to 52. Once Eisenhower was elected in 1952, he told them, don't touch him. He said, if you touch him, we'll come. So that protected Taiwan. That was something really sovereign of the Lord. So from 49 to 52, it was a prevailing atmosphere to preach the gospel. Because they all didn't think they had any time before the communists would be coming, and probably most of them would be killed. So they preached the gospel. They had gospel marches, and they preached all over Taiwan, especially the city of Taipei. And they just increased in very large amounts. They went from that 500 to about 20,000 within 3 years' time. And then they continued, of course, to increase. But it was a large increase. And the churches, of course, then began to be built up in Taiwan. And Brother Lee, of course, went back to Hong Kong to meet Brother Nee in 1950. This is the last time Brother Lee saw Brother Nee. In 1950, they met in Hong Kong and were there together for a few months. Then Brother Lee tried to persuade Brother Nee, don't go back. Come with me back to Taiwan. But he said, no, all the churches, all the saints need me. I must go back. And so he went back. And of course, just in 2 years later, 1952, Brother Nee was put into prison. And he stayed in prison until he died in prison 20 years later. He was in prison for 20 years. From 1952 until June of 1972, where we received the news of his death. So that was the last time Brother Lee saw Brother Nee. Then, of course, the Lord's move there in China, well, I should say in Taiwan. The churches begin to grow, also and to spread and to be built up. And then, you could say for another 10 years, quite well, or another 9 years. And then it was in 1961 that Brother Lee came to this country. Actually, I have to go back. In 1958, he made a visit to this country. In 1958, he made a visit to this country, going through this country on his way to England. And at that time, he spoke at a place in Los Angeles called Westmoreland Chapel. And that's when John Ingalls heard him the first time. It was in Westmoreland Chapel in 1958 in Los Angeles. And of course, you've heard John share it, I'm sure, but I'll never forget just the one word. Brother Lee had known English all of his life, but he hadn't spoken it that much. He studied it, he could read it, but his speaking wasn't that clear. But the way he started his message in 1958, because this is what he was beginning to see at that time. He opened the message in this way by saying, did you eat Jesus today? In his broken English. That's how he began the message. And of course it shocked everyone. No one had ever heard such a term. But he began by saying, did you Eat Jesus today. John said he could never forget that. Today, that's common to us. But you have to realize, in 1958, in this country, no one had ever heard such a word about eating Jesus. And the Lord was showing Brother Lee at that time this very matter. So He spoke on the tree of life and eating Jesus. And then after visiting there, he went on to, you've heard him say, visit Honor Oak in England. And he stayed there for quite some time. Of course, I think you know, and probably we don't need to go into the detail of Austin Sparks having visited Taiwan in 1956 and in 1957. And in 1956, everything was fine. In 1957, it wasn't so fine, because he did not agree with the ground of the church. Anyway, Brother Lee was responding to his invitation to come to Honor Oak. And so he spoke in Honor Oak for a few weeks there. And his last message was on John and the message to the 7 churches. And the main point in that message at Honor Oak that eventually we heard tore the whole thing down was that the ministry is for the church, not the church for the ministry. Showing that John, such a minister and such an apostle, was to the 7 churches. Amen. The ministry is for the church, not the church for the ministry. Because if you're familiar with the way Austin Sparks operated, it was to have ministry centers. Everything was for his ministry. So Brother Lee just gave that message from Revelation, of which he said, it's clear all the ministry, especially the ministry, is for the church. Amen. Not the church for the ministry. It's not that we have a church so we can minister. It's that there is the one ministry for the building up of the church. The ministry is for the church. Anyway, later on he heard that eventually it was that word that caused the whole thing there to crumble. He didn't intend that. But if you know the history, there was some trouble caused by Austin Sparks disagreeing with the ground. Anyway, that was in 1958. Then he came back in 1961 to the United States for the purpose of some business matters and some other matters. And it was while he was here in 61 up to around, I believe, September, October of 1962. He was here for some time. He was just fixing to go back to Taiwan because they had a lot of conferences scheduled. A big conference with 10,000 was scheduled. But I have to mention, of course, before this, in May of 1962, the church in Los Angeles took the ground and began to meet. They had, of course, some fellowship with Brother Lee, and Brother Lee did not tell them anything. He just said, you pray. You pray. You just pray. Whatever you feel. Actually, in 58, they tried to do nothing. He said, no, don't do anything. And I think in 60, they wanted to do something, and he discouraged it. But by 62, he didn't discourage, he didn't encourage. He just said pray. So by May of 1962, the church in Los Angeles took the ground in Brother Samuel Chang's home, I believe there in Los Angeles. Well, they had around 30 people, 28 of whom were Chinese. And they generally call it 2.5 Caucasians, because the half was the sister who eventually, although she stayed a long time, even into Eldon Hall, she left. The 2 were John Ingalls and Jim Ritzky. That was the 2 Caucasians that began to meet in 1962 of May. That's when they took the ground. But in Brother Lee was going back to Taiwan. I mean, if they took the ground, that's up to them. But he was going back to Taiwan. He had no burden at all to come to this country. He had no consideration. He had no burden. He figured let them take the books and let them do it whatever. His burden right then was Taiwan. Especially in China, they had no burden for this country. Anyway, but it was while he was in this country, at that time, there began to be some things happen to cause some great pressure upon him. Some great pressure. Some real situations that were happening. And through this pressure, of course, he went to the Lord. And he went to the Lord. And he went to the Lord. And the pressure did not let up. It increased and increased and increased. And he went to the Lord. Why, Lord? Why is this happening? Something like this. I don't, of course, have the exact words. I've heard things here and there. But there, I'm just trying to put it all together. Anyway, the decision was, though, eventually he realized the Lord wanted him to stay in this country. And the pressure didn't stop. It's not that he said yes and the pressure stopped. That's our concept. No, the pressure continued, but he got clear what the Lord wanted. That was to stay in this country. So he called Brother Samuel Chang. I've heard this story many times. And this was in the fall of maybe it might have been right at the 1st of December, I think it was, or the last of November of 1962. He called him in Los Angeles, and he said, Brother Chang, I'm coming to Los Angeles. Well, they'd heard he was leaving because a big conference was already being scheduled in Taiwan. And he said, you are? Oh, you're coming before you're going back to Taiwan. He said, no, I'm coming to Los Angeles to stay. He said, oh, you're going to stay 2 or 3 weeks. He said, no, I'm coming to Los Angeles to stay indefinitely. Well, they were all just shocked. And so Brother Lee came. He was in the States. He came to Los Angeles. And in 1962, December, they began to pray. And they had the first conference in December of 1962, which in an old house in Los Angeles, in front of about 70 people, he released the messages of the all-inclusive Christ. This was the real beginning of the ministry for the Lord's recovery in this country.